Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the March 2024 Archaeology Hour. My name is Songjung Kim. I'm the president of the AIA Toronto Society, and we are honored to be hosting this event, especially as it pertains to a very important Canadian topic, which is in fact potentially a global North American and worldwide issue as well. Many thanks to Meredith Langwitz and Rachel Mead for the invitation and their efforts to organize and upkeep this lecture series. So the AIA is North America's largest and oldest archaeological organization with over 200,000 members worldwide, ranging from vocational archaeologists, students in archaeology and related fields to enthusiasts and interested members of the community. The AIA is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things archaeological, and every member of the Archaeological Institute of America receives a subscription to Archaeology magazine and the option to also tag on a subscription to the more scholarly American Journal of Archaeology. The AIA also offers opportunities to attend lectures of interest, such as this one, and other organized events related to local, national, and international archaeology. Also, chances to participate in excavations and tours. You can get access to all of these things by becoming a member of the AIA. And many thanks, of course, to all AIA members and friends who have either joined or renewed your memberships recently. Your membership fees contribute to good and important work across the globe, supporting research, excavation, education, and preservation efforts. So if you haven't joined yet and are interested in doing so, we would so appreciate if you would take a few minutes and if you can, to support the AIA and its mission. You can do this by scanning this QR code, or you can come back anytime to archaeological.org/join. I believe Rachel will also drop it into the Zoom chat for you to follow from there, if that's possible. And when you do join, take a second to designate your local society. This is very important. And of course, member benefits include eligibility for AIA awards and grants, as well as discounts on tours and registrations for conferences like our annual meeting. And students, if you're in the audience now, especially, you should note that the annual memberships start as low as $30 a year. So it's definitely worthwhile. And of course, to all of you, whether you are members or donors or both, we are grateful for your support. You make it possible to continue research, fund educational experiences for students, preserve sites, publish new and exciting discoveries, and run programs for students, professionals, and archaeological enthusiasts. We've had a terrific lineup of speakers so far in the Archaeology Hour series, and we have one more left in April. Just as a reminder, Deborah Carlson at Texas A&M will be speaking on excavating a shipwrecked marble column destined for the Temple of Apollo at Claros. So an underwater archaeology topic, which is always super exciting. And I do want to give you a friendly reminder. It's just that this lecture is a live presentation that's being recorded by the AIA. And recording by attendees is strictly prohibited. The AIA respects the intellectual property of its presenters and asks that the viewer do the same. So thank you very much for your cooperation. Now, there's no need to record anyway, because if you need to rewatch it or if you need to leave early, tonight's presentation and all of the Archaeology Hour talks will be available on the AIA YouTube channel. So with that, I'm really excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Kisha Supernant, who is the director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology and a professor in the Department of Anthropology at University of Alberta. An award-winning teacher, researcher, and writer, her research interests include the relationship between cultural identities, landscapes, and the use of space, Métis archaeology, and heart-centered archaeological practice. Her research with Indigenous communities, including Métis and First Nations in Western Canada, explores how archaeologists and communities can build collaborative research relationships and uphold Indigenous rights to cultural heritage. She leads the Exploring Métis Identity Through Archaeology, EMITA, a collaborative research project which takes a relational approach to exploring the material past of Métis communities, including her own family in Western Canada. And recently, she's been increasingly engaged in using technologies to locate and protect unmarked burials around residential schools at the request of Indigenous communities. And I believe that's what we're going to be hearing tonight. She's published in peer-reviewed journals on GIS in archaeology, collaborative archaeological practice, Métis archaeology, and Indigenous archaeology in the post-TRC era, as well as co-edited 2 books. She was recently named to Edmonton's Top 40 Under 40 by Avenue Magazine and elected to the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Scientists, and Artists. She's also president of the Indigenous Heritage Circle. We're now ready for the main event entitled Finding the Children Using Archaeology to Search for Unmarked Graves at Indian Residential School Sites in Canada, which is a project done in collaboration with the Canadian Archaeological Association Working Group on Unmarked Graves. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Supernant.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's much appreciated. I'm really grateful to have the chance to be here. I will need you to stop sharing your slides so I can share mine, if you could, and we can get underway here as well. Tansei, Kisha Supernant egwa awasa kapigiwita hadnitsikatsan, amiskwiti waskaigan ochinia otipimisiwaknia. Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here. I am joining you today from Amiskwaciwâskahikan, which is the Cree word for Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. I am Métis, citizen of the Métis Nation of Alberta, and this is my homeland. And a lot of the places that I work are in collaboration with my own relatives more broadly. This evening, I have the honor to speak with you a little bit about the work that myself and a whole collaboration of archaeologists have been doing to support Indigenous communities in the sacred and difficult work of trying to locate potential burial sites for children who never came home from Indian residential schools in Canada. So this is very much a collaborative effort, and so I'm presenting really on behalf of the work of the group. So I mentioned a little bit about myself. You had quite a lengthy introduction, and it's important for me to just situate that this, as an Indigenous person, an Indigenous scholar, I do a lot of work that is attentive to my relations, and I've also been working with community now for 20 plus years. And I started the work of helping to locate unmarked graves well before 2021. My first opportunity to work in this area was in 2018, and there are members of our working group who have been doing this work since the early 2000s as well. I want to start a little bit high level. I will get into some of the specifics of what's happening right now in Canada, but I thought I would start with giving you some context as to why this might be important to talk about during an archaeology hour for the Archaeological Institute of America, because it really addresses what I think is a fundamental question that many of us are grappling with, especially in settler colonial contexts, so places where there has been this history of colonization, which is, what are we doing archaeology for? What is the driving force behind it? Who is it serving? And what are the ways in which archaeology might need to continue to transform to better meet the needs of community, especially those descendant and ancestral communities with whom we work closely in settler colonial contexts, but other places throughout the world as well. One of the challenges, of course, is the legacy of the discipline itself. And this is important for the work I'm doing now, because archaeology doesn't always have a good history of being a good relation to Indigenous communities. It's often been very extractive. I mean, if you think about the work we do, it often involves physical extraction of materials from the ground, for example. Now, we do that carefully and we record a lot, but it still is a form of extraction. And it also is an extraction in colonial contexts of knowledge, where we become the storytellers of the past without necessarily giving that ability to tell those stories from the Indigenous descendant communities with whom we may work. Archaeology really exists in part because it came alongside colonization. There wasn't archaeology in the lands we call Canada prior to the advent of that colonization. And it's important to know that that's part of our history and our legacy in many ways. That kind of idea of collecting information from around the world, putting it into museums, and sharing it for the good of everyone remains very tied up with particular ways of knowing and being in the world. We very much center around science, right? Archaeology, while it is a form of narrating the past, is very much grounded in the scientific method. And that is one way to understand the world. It's not the only way. And it often can be quite exclusive, meaning that it centers itself. We center ourselves as the tellers of the truth of the past. And I think we need to expand beyond that. And many others have made this argument to say there are many ways to know and understand the past, of which archaeology is one. And archaeology also has been pretty exclusive. There are particular types of people who have tended to practice archaeology, and we've seen a pretty, I would say, significant shift over the past 15 or 20 years, but there's a long journey ahead to really make the kind of space that's needed for diverse voices and for different ways of knowing and understanding the past. So archaeology has been part of a system that has marginalized, that has oppressed and attempted to, in some cases, eradicate other voices. And this is a really important aspect of the work that I do, because archaeology has actually been quite harmful in many places. And if you've ever had the opportunity to work in an Indigenous community, we don't have a great reputation, and for really good reason. When I remember when I was first working in community, and you would often get that, oh, you're just, here to rob graves and take our stuff. And that's based on lived experience in many communities, and especially in Indigenous communities. So my orientation toward archaeology is one that seeks to not just not do harm, which I think we should all be seeking to, not do any additional harm, but to actually think about restorative justice. The ways that the methods and the strengths of archaeology, it has many, can actually be used to seek redress for those historical and often ongoing wrongs. So how can we use the solid and strong scientific techniques of archaeology to address the interests and needs of community? So still doing good science, but doing it for a different purpose, perhaps, or addressing the questions that matter to the communities with whom we work. How do we think about the role of archaeological knowledge in seeking justice? This becomes very important in the work around residential schools, which I'll come back to later. But what is the role of archaeological evidence in supporting that seeking of justice? It's also about creating that broad umbrella. How do we create an expansive space to understand the past from multiple perspectives? And what can retelling of some of the histories we take for granted actually bring to light? How can we expose some of those truths which we might otherwise forget or might be lost? And then undoing those histories of harm and extraction. And this can include things such as sending home the belongings of Indigenous ancestors, should that be what the community might wish. So an actual, undoing that harm of extraction. Now, another important grounding aspect to my work that informs what I'm going to talk about in terms of the broader issue at hand tonight is that heart-centered practice. So in 2020, I had the great privilege of working with 3 other amazing scholars to edit this volume, Archaeologies of the Heart. So this was with Jane Baxter, Natasha Lyons, and Sonia Atele, and then a whole community of authors within this book, where we really invite a different approach to archaeology, one that explicitly considers all of the aspects that make us human, the fullness of our human experience, not just our intellects, which are powerful, but we are often asked in academic disciplines like archaeology to primarily work with our minds. And yet the heart is also a powerful source of knowledge. And we created this invitation to try to shift the ways in which we work together as archaeologists and the ways in which we work with those materials of the past. So very briefly, I just wanted to run through the 4 chambers of heart-centered practice at a very high level. You also can go read the introduction to this book that goes into them in more detail. But they are care, right? Care for each other, care for ourselves, care for the belongings of the past, building those strong and healthy communities of practice. Emotion. This again is a really important part of the work I'm going to talk about tonight, but we do experience emotions in the world. All of us do. We are human. And that emotional side to ourselves is something we're often asked to leave at the door when we enter into academic spaces, and also something we don't consider enough in how we understand the past. So much of our understanding of human decision-making in archaeology, at least that I've experienced, the kind of discussions that happen are around sometimes biology, so biological drivers of decision-making, or, status, power, those sorts of things. But what about the decisions we make based on emotions? And how could we imagine an understanding of the past that better made space for the emotional lives of ancient people, and then also recognizing our own emotional responses and connections to the work, not because we have to, use it to reduce bias, but because it's a powerful tool. It's a powerful way of understanding the world as well. The 3rd chamber is relation. This is relations with each other, relations with the communities that we work with, maintaining strong and healthy boundaries so that those relations can not be violated. And we know that happens in archaeology. And then the 4th chamber is rigor. And this is really important because oftentimes when we talk about things like emotion or the sort of spiritual nature of some of the things we do, we can get shut down by saying, well, that's not rigorous. How do you know that's true? We have to do scientific testing, et cetera. The main point I want to make here is that, well, 2 points. One is emotion doesn't make us less rigorous. It's ignoring it that does a disservice, because we need to understand the relationship with the emotional responses we may have and the science that we do. Also, this idea that caring about something means we're biased. I will tell you something really important. I do better science because I care about the work that I do. I am not going to go tell a community that I found something that I can't prove with science because it would actually do harm. So I'm not going to overstate my results. I'm not going to find things that I can't back up with good, strong, rigorous science because I care so deeply about the outcome of my work. So care makes me a better scientist. The final point I want to make just on this slide is every knowledge system has internal rigor. So Indigenous knowledge is rigorous. It has been developed over thousands of years. There's checks and balances built into the system about what constitutes knowledge. So, science isn't the only system of knowledge with rigor. So how do these 2 orientations, restorative justice and heart-centered practice, then come to bear on what archaeologists have been asked to do, which is help communities to locate potential unmarked graves relating to Indigenous children that were taken from those communities. I just want to note that this photo is the photo of the year, and it's done by Amber Bracken, who's an Indigenous photographer, and it was photo of the year in 2021. Little bit of background so that everyone in the audience can understand. Residential schools, they have a deeper origin, but they became Government of Canada policy in the 1880s, where every status Indian child, so under the Indian Act, was required to attend a residential school with the intent of breeding out the Indigenousness of those children, to assimilate them, to make them like non-Indigenous Canadians at the time, to provide Christian education, to provide skills that would make them good workers, and to take away language, culture, connection to their community. That was the intention. And it was based on these principles, which anthropology is an absolute handmaiden of, which is that being non-Indigenous, being from white Christian background, was fundamentally better than being Indigenous. This was the motivating factor. So children were taken generally around school age, although some of these institutions also operated as orphanages, and children ended up in them much younger than 6 or 7. And every child was required, and if they did not go, if their parents refused to send them, the parents would be arrested. And so there was a legal consequence to not sending children to residential schools. The residential school system, formally starting in the 1880s, the last residential school closed in 1996. So certainly within my lifetime and others on the call here. A lot of schools transitioned to day schools, usually in the 1970s and 80s, but the formal residential school system ended in 1996. Throughout that time, it's estimated that about 150,000 children were forced to attend these institutions. They were government funded, but primarily church run. About 70% Catholic Church, but also Anglican, United, other denominations had roles as well. From the very beginning of the system, it was understood and expected that children would die in those institutions. There's a few reasons for this. One, of course, is the level of child mortality at the time, which in the general population was greater than it is today. But there were also knowing that children were being taken away from home, and sometimes thousands of kilometers, so well over 1,500 miles in some cases, from their home communities. And so school plans were built with cemeteries. Now, many children did not come home from residential schools. And there's a few layers to this that are really important. The work that I am currently doing and my colleagues are doing is not to prove this. We know this. There are thousands of records of churches, of the government, that clearly state that children died. The other thing to note is that while there was greater child mortality, especially in the earlier days of this, there were whistleblowers, even in the early 1900s, who were shocked at the conditions and at the number of children who were dying. And I just want to also note, talking about this is very difficult. I won't be showing any specific images of things that are triggering, but I will be talking about things that are triggering. And I'm just recognizing, I probably should have said this before, because what I'm about to say is really quite horrific, in that at one of the schools, a doctor, Dr. Bryce, noted that it was about 25% mortality at that school. That is nowhere near what it was in the general population. It is much, much higher. And many of the children's deaths were related to the conditions, the lack of medical care, just unhygienic lack of food. They were not designed to support the health and well-being of these children. So the truth of this is we already know that thousands of children died. The work that we're doing right now is trying to find their places of burial. And because many families, especially if their children were farther away from home, may not have been notified that their child had died and did not know where they were buried. And so the work now is to try to reconnect those families and their descendants to where the places of the lost children are. There were 140 recognized residential schools across Canada. There are a number of other related institutions, so maybe not formally recognized residential schools, but certainly institutions that took children and had a role to play here. So many places all throughout Canada. In the 2007, there was a class action lawsuit which led to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had the goal of witnessing survivor testimony, recognizing the harm of the residential school system, and really made the system of residential schools more visible in Canada. But it was very much focused on survivors. It was not focused on finding missing children, although so much of that came up in their work that they dedicated a chapter of their final report just to the missing children. So even during this process, it became very clear that this was a huge issue. Then the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released 94 calls to action to all aspects of Canadian life. One of them was around finding the children. So this was released in 2015, and very little action had happened on this particular call until Tk'emlúps to Secwe, but there had been recognition that this was an issue. Now, in May of 2021, the news broke, originally reported as 215 children in a mass grave. None of those pieces of information are actually borne out by the evidence, including the evidence presented by the expert who worked with that community. It's in fact ground penetrating radar results, 200 features of interest, but it hit the news in this way, and that caused, of course, a pretty big response. Response from Indigenous communities, a response from non-Indigenous Canadians, and a global response. I did about 180 media interviews over the year and a half after this announcement in May of 2021. Everything from small local newspapers to being interviewed by Anderson Cooper for 60 Minutes. This was a very big story. That moment meant that a whole bunch of things happened. So big growth in projects, government started committing money to do work in this area. Because of the way the results had originally been announced, there was a real focus on ground penetrating radar. We were getting calls from community being, can you come and scan our schools? So we had to do a lot of talking about what was actually going to be useful, what ground penetrating radar could and could not do, and I'll touch on that briefly here. But it also created a huge triggering of trauma for survivors, intergenerational survivors, communities. That still reverberates in community today. So a lot has changed since 2021. What was interesting is in that aftermath of Tk'emlúps, the people that many Indigenous communities started to call upon were archaeologists. So if we come back to what I was saying at the beginning, where we had a reputation of being grave robbers, we are now being asked to be grave finders. So this is a really different space for archaeology. Now, of course, there's a number of reasons for why archaeology has become at the heart of this to an extent. In part because we've established better relations over the past 20 or 25 years, been more responsive to community and their needs. And also there are archaeologists who use geophysical and remote sensing techniques in their work, and it's translatable in some of these contexts. So I want to talk then briefly about what happened in terms of archaeology right after Tk'emlúps. In June of 2021, myself and the folks you see on this list came together. I'm the chair of this group where we'd all been doing work with community and often in similar types of contexts, some residential school work, some who'd used geophysical or remote sensing techniques. And we created this group. We meet monthly. We've created a series of resources to try to provide more knowledge about what the different kinds of techniques can do. We've developed best practices based on what we currently know in the science. And we try to support communities who need help in doing the search. Only ever at the request of community, but we do try to be an ally and support wherever we can. So what archaeology is being asked to do is help to figure out the different landscapes that residential schools are in. You saw the map all over Canada, many different geological contexts. Some are on reserves, some are in cities, some are in farmers' fields. So how do you approach the search for these potential unmarked graves in different landscapes? What technology is going to be useful? What is not going to be useful? How do you apply them to have the best chance in getting results that could indicate unmarked graves potentially? How do we report on and interpret data across this vast landscape? And what can't we do, right? What are the possibilities, but what are the limitations? Because if anyone who's worked with geophysics, we can't guarantee anything. We can find things, we can build confidence, but it's not an X-ray, it's not a certainty. And there was a lot of hope at the beginning that this could do all the work of finding the children, but it's one part of a much larger puzzle. One of the other core parts of this work is that it requires a set of values and approaches that, really are good for archaeology generally, but are essential in this work. So this is an emotional process. It is very difficult for the community and for anyone who's involved in the search. Going in and hearing the stories of survivors, seeing what they're sharing can be really difficult. So that emotional safety piece is really important. We don't ever do any of this work unless the community leads. So they reach out to us. We say, okay, what is it that you need? How can we help? We center ceremony. So different nations will have different ceremonies, but all of this work is very sacred and so requires the support of ceremony for the community and for the search team. So everyone on my team and the folks who work in the working group, we all respect that and will participate whenever is appropriate and follow the lead of community on that. A lot of what we know in this space comes from community knowledge. So survivors have knowledge. There are also community members who sometimes have seen or encountered things that can point toward places that we need to search. So we work with that knowledge to begin with. We try to clarify expectations. What can we do? What can't we do? We provide results as quickly as reasonable to, not have the community waiting to have that knowledge. And then all of the data that we gather in this process belongs to the community. So you won't see a publication about residential school landscapes with data in it unless the community has explicitly said they want to do that because it is their data. One of the first things that the working group did was say, okay, remote sensing and geophysics are part of a much larger process. They cannot be the start point or the end point of this. So where do they fit into a broader approach that understands archives, oral history, wellness, and also the possibility for forensic investigation? Where do we fit into this broader process? So this was one of the first things that we developed to try to communicate that this was not the solution. This was just part of a process. When we approach this work with community, we start with a core set of questions. And because these landscapes are large, some residential schools have 600 acres of land associated with them, and communities would come and say, we need to scan everywhere. And as archaeologists, we'd say, well, probably not everywhere. We need to narrow down what makes sense, where to target, what are your highest priorities. So these questions help us. Are there records of children being buried? If so, where are they, right? Where are the records and where might the children be? Because there are cemeteries that have been decommissioned and basically leveled, and we may be able to relocate them, for example. Or there may be existing cemeteries where there's areas with unmarked graves that could have residential school children in them as well. Where else might children have been buried or otherwise disposed of? Because we hear other stories as well. And what might or might not work to try to find those areas? Where do survivors want us to look? Where were there places that they had heard about, seen things? Where would they like us to look? And pretty much where survivors have us look, we often find potential unmarked graves in different kind of ways. What's happened to the land since the residential school was in operation? Have things been developed? Have they been leveled? Have they been plowed? All of these are important pieces of information to be able to say what may and may not work. And then what is the soil like? There are certain techniques that don't work well in certain soils. So, I'm not going to bring out a ground penetrating radar into an area full of wet clay. It's not going to see much. So trying to figure out what is the best approach, and then who has access to the land, who owns it now. So we start often from questions like this to get guidance from the community to be able to then say, okay, with all of these things factored in, what are some options for you? And then we look at the techniques that we have. So I'm going to move pretty quickly through this, just wanting to get through my slides and leave some time for questions, but I'm happy to talk about more details in the Q&A. We start often from the air, so historical aerial photos, newly collected data from drones or from airplanes, or satellite data sometimes to try to build out knowledge of the land. So these can be an important first step to get a sense of the landscape, to see what's present and what isn't. And it's also usually a bit quicker. One of the most important things is integrating historical aerial photos. Many of the schools were in operation through the 60s and 70s, like I said, a few later, but most schools were in operation into that era. And there's good historical aerial photos, certainly from the 1940s onward. This can help us understand the landscape change, where building footprints and foundations may be, and it helps us target different techniques for different places. So this is just an example of us mapping out some of the residential school buildings in one of the places where we worked. And there are certain areas here that we wouldn't use ground penetrating radar on, for example, because all it's going to show us is a building footprint. So this has been really important and building this into a GIS. We have just done basic photogrammetry with UAVs, which can be useful in historic cemeteries and in open areas. If there is visible surface markers of graves, this can be mounds or depressions. And it's relatively easy. Having an inexpensive drone to fly works well here, but it does have to have the right conditions. So if it's been plowed or leveled in any way, this is not likely to be very helpful, other than to provide perhaps a good base image for other data. We have been applying LiDAR, so this is useful to map landscape areas that are forested. And of course, again, if there hasn't been leveling of the ground, then we can sometimes get surface impressions related to unmarked graves, although it really depends on the quality of the LiDAR and the resolution. But it can be helpful also to eliminate areas that are not suitable for particular types of ground searching. The main technology that we have been applying, although we haven't only been applying GPR, it has been the focus, is ground penetrating radar. One of the big things we had to work on communicating was that it is not an X-ray. It is much more like an ultrasound in that you're sending a wave into the ground. It travels down, it hits different things and reflects back. Depending on what it's reflecting off of, we can create sort of subsurface maps of different shapes, different types of material. Part of the reason we turn to ground penetrating radar is it is the best established method for mapping unmarked graves. It's been used in cemetery contexts. It's been used in, throughout the world in different places. It's been used for both individual graves and for mass graves. So it is established as one of the tools that can be helpful. It is most useful in formal burial contexts, so in an organized cemetery, because a lot of what we're doing is trying to make sense of the shapes that are in the reflections themselves. So when we're doing a ground penetrating radar survey, we grid out areas and we cover every inch of the ground. So typically in 25 centimeter transects. And we then try to make sense of what it is we're seeing by building out a subsurface map. Interpretation is challenging because of variability in the soil, in the burial practices, the fact that there are other reasons why grave-shaped pits might be in the ground, for example. And we are still advancing the interpretation side. We're still working on refining what kind of traits in the data can be clearly associated with known burial contexts, and then how can they be applied at residential school landscapes to try to make sense of what it is that we are seeing. One other quick note on ground penetrating radar, of course, is that we don't actually always know for sure that, well, we rarely know for sure if we're seeing a grave or not. The most confident we can be is in places where we have a known grave context, good GPR signal data, and we are able to correlate it with another piece of information, such as, a depression in the ground. So we are exploring other forms of ground-based remote sensing in this as well, including magnetic approaches and conductivity and resistivity, but they are less well established. So they haven't been as much of a focus in this the last couple of years, especially. So just a few notes of caution, and I'll try to wrap up in the next couple of minutes, which is these are challenging targets. Graves are difficult to detect. At the same time, there are things that we can do to increase our confidence. So we can eliminate things. We know what a pipe looks like, know what a rock looks like, we know what tree roots and rodent holes look like. But then trying to detect the burial, we look often at traits in the ground penetrating radar itself. But is it in a cemetery or not will determine our confidence in whether or not we're finding potential graves. Were they more formal burials? Were they more informal burials? That can be difficult. The geology matters a lot. I've worked in community contexts where they have wet clay and the GPR signal just gets absorbed into the wet clay and nothing comes back. So we know that we're in a cemetery, there's marked graves, nothing on the GPR. So in that case, we say, okay, this may not be the best technique here. How else can we search? What other tools and techniques do we have? Preservation matters to an extent, although we're looking at grave shafts, right? We don't see bones or anything. So it's really dependent upon some of these or geological conditions again, and whether or not those grave shafts persist and for how long. And it's very sensitive work. And so communities want us to find graves, but we can never say we found one. We can just say, we think this is a possible, this is a probable, we can't be 100% sure with this technique. So just a couple more quick things before we move into the Q&A. We have developed a pretty extensive set of resources that try to walk through these techniques and approaches in more detail. So these are a series of short videos we have. We have a series of technical documents that lay out possibilities, best practices, limitations. So again, we want to do good science here, but we also want to respect the fact that communities are seeking and deserve answers. So where can we help? Where can't we help? When do they need to look for other information? So just to summarize, archaeologists are being asked to do this very difficult task. This is a different approach to archaeology than I certainly have seen in my career, where there's a very significant issue for Indigenous communities, and archaeologists are trying to step up to meet that need, to do the good science, to apply the relevant techniques to address the need, provide that kind of guidance, that places that communities can go to ask those questions. We also are really starting to shift toward building community capacity, because there's 15 members of the working group, there's 140 residential schools and 600 First Nations. So we need a lot more people who can do this well. And ideally, for us, it's Indigenous community folks who can do it. So we're working on building out our training. And ultimately, communities are seeking justice. So part of the missing children is that no one's been held accountable for the number of children who never came home and the families who were never told about their children. And our work is going to likely end up in that sphere. So it's another reason why we do the best possible science we can, because it needs to be able to stand up as a form of evidence. And it can be powerful evidence. Again, GPR alone is not going to prove a grave is anywhere, but it could contribute and be layered on with multiple forms of information to support that evidence being brought forward. So it's ultimately about trying to bring forward those difficult truths. So archaeology can be a powerful way to tell the truth of the past, but this is a different kind of truth than we see as the focus of many other archaeological projects. So I want to say thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to some Q&A. Hi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Supernant. Really, thank you for sharing such an important work for many reasons. And also, I personally appreciate you, doing so with so much courage and dignity, especially something that's very emotionally charging for you. And I really appreciated the introduction, introducing us the concept of the heart-centered archaeology, which I think is really novel and extremely important. So with that, we've had some questions rolling in, but of course, there's only not a lot of time, and there are more questions than you could probably address. So I'm just going to kind of give you a few with the help of some of the organizers to try and address this. The first question that I have, and somebody have asked, is really about what kinds of cooperation or resistance have you had from either the authorities that ran the schools, or I imagine that there's, you have to have permits to do anything on, and especially if it's private land. So, if you can share maybe an anecdote or two, or generally can speak to that, that would be great.
There definitely are barriers and challenges to this work. I will try to keep it relatively brief, but just say there are many. One of the things that I have seen, though, is a shift from the days of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to now. There is more, at least stated, desire to make things more accessible and that kind of thing. I did briefly have a look at a Q&A saying, like a Grey Nuns archive. Many of those sort of orders are making their records more available than they ever have before. And the government certainly is trying to provide funding for this kind of work in a way that they have never done so before. But the legal and sort of regulatory landscape is complicated, because in Canada, we have provincial and territorially managed heritage. There's no federal umbrella for it. So different provinces are requiring permits or not requiring permits. Is it archaeology? Is it not archaeology? Because it's sort of in a gray area in many cases. And then the kind of legal implications for any kind of forensic investigation. There is not a lot of clarity right now about that, because most of the work is outside of what we would consider the sort of time of interest for forensics, which is functionally usually about a 50-year period for criminal investigation, at least in Canada. So there's a lot of unknowns. This is partly why the Canadian government created the Office of the Special Interlocutor on Missing Children and Unmarked Graves. That was established in June of 2022. She has a 2-year mandate. It's a Mohawk lawyer named Kimberly Murray. Her final report's coming out in June, which hopefully will help map where some of those barriers are and how they might need to be changed. But generally people are trying to be cooperative. There's just a lot of structural issues that remain that are not easy to move.
Right, thank you. Also, there's an interesting question. So just to make it clear, no actual excavation has been done, correct?
So no, I mean, the excavation part is not something I am directly involved in or
Right.
members of the working group. I will say that the only community that has made anything public about any kind of excavation was Pine Creek First Nation, who had done some work in GPR reflections found in the basement of a church. That's the only one that's been public. I suspect we will see more conversations as things emerge. But there have been examples where there have been graves found associated with residential schools because of natural disasters. Like there was a big flood in 2013, and I think it was approximately 35 bodies washed out of a bank at the Dunbow Industrial School. So we do know that those things are likely there. Communities are figuring out what that looks like because every residential school had children from multiple nations and they might be buried in multiple places. So trying to figure out who's where is something that is, of course, very complicated. And every nation would need to be on board with any kind of exhumation or excavation because you don't know who it is you may be digging up, right? Because of the nature of the history of these institutions.
Right, yes, I understand it's a complicated question. And so, I mean, I guess there has been lots of sort of questions relating to that, right? Relating to what are the pathways to excavation or what also enables an ethical retrieval. And I think some of that, yeah, you've addressed.
Yes, yeah. That work has been talked about, but has not really been fully started yet. Again, I think a lot of us are waiting to see what we might need to put in place. You know, like is it something like what they have in Guatemala for the disappeared? Like what kind of model would work to do this ethically, that respects community needs and wishes, but also maintains the kind of data security that would be needed for something like this?
Thank you so much. Okay, lots and lots of questions, but some of the early, I wanted to kind of present you some of the really earlier ones. And of course, that boils down to if you could speak to or an estimate of maybe how many missing children there might have been in Canada. But on top of that, in relation to the very different picture that seems to be emerging in the US, and why, I mean, or like your thoughts on what is going on in the US. Yeah.
Yes, and I'll reflect what I can. It was interesting to see that after Tk'emlúps, the conversation in the US seemed to shift. And this became an issue that was like, oh, we also had federal Indian boarding schools here in the United States. And there certainly have been people working in aspects of this for decades. But I think having the direction from the Secretary of the Interior, and that being, of course, an Indigenous woman, did kind of set the stage for advancing this work more in the United States. One of the things I will note is that because we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there was already an extensive set of records. So, and a broader public understanding of the residential school system, which was a different groundwork for the search for missing children than I think you have in the US, where it's been a much more sort of institution by institution approach as opposed to a systems approach. So gathering all of the archival information that helps to inform all of this work, I think is still something that would benefit moving this forward in the United States. But I have definitely seen a lot more movement. And actually one of the members of the working group who's at a US institution had presented about our work to try to share across the border so people know the resources we're developing, because they probably would be quite useful and relevant if this is something that archaeologists are being asked to take up in the United States as well.
Right. Thank you so much. Okay, another one that asks, about maybe some other techniques other than technology, and mentioning cadaver canines. Would it be useful in this work at
Yes.
all?
So I
Um,
can speak to this. There has been definitely historic human remains detection dogs or herds. So a type of cadaver dog trained more specifically for historic human remains. Many nations are starting to use those, especially in the areas where you don't have an organized cemetery, but there is concern. And we are currently, it's not yet up on our website, but one of the members of the working group has been working directly in this and actually has a trained dog. And we have some best practices emerging around that, including independent dog teams, what it means when a dog scents, right, and that kind of thing. But it is a useful tool both to work with some of the data we are working with, like ground penetrating radar, but also to search in larger areas where you're only looking for maybe very clandestine things that GPR is not going to be well suited to, or inside of buildings. There has been a little bit of use of this now too. So context that the technology is not well suited to, as well as layering on additional information to the technology. So yes, and I suspect we'll see more of that. And we always recommend that as one of the multiple techniques that communities might consider in this work.
Right, great, thank you. Okay, so the next question I have here is, in the last year or so, there has been an uptick in denialism from a certain segment of the population. Have you encountered this, and how do you deal with it?
Oh, yes, I encounter it on a weekly basis, I would say. I'll just make a couple of notes here. There has been a rise in denialism around the residential school missing children. But residential school denialism has been around since the residential schools were in operation. And it's not a denial of the system. It's a denial of the harm of the system and the scope and the scale of the harm. So when the first news came out that 215 children were found in a mass grave, again, none of which was actually accurate, it was all relatively quickly corrected, it became a talking point of like, no bodies have been found and there's not 215 children, which there may be 215 children who passed away at that school. We don't know that yet for sure. But the kind of narrative that's emerged is using that to undermine everything that we're doing when we don't need that case to know that there are thousands. We don't have a final number. Murray Sinclair and the TRC estimated between 10 and 15,000 was a reasonable estimate. We don't know that for sure yet, but I suspect even the archives may get us to that number, right? Let alone the additional work that we might want to do. So I guess, it's denialism is always about trying to like shift to undermine the expertise, undermine the survivors and their testimony. And I encourage you, if you see things that are like, it's all a big hoax or this is not, go to the actual data sources, read the actual what Tk'emlúps actually said in their press conference in July. And none of that is reflected in the denialism, right? We're not, and so it is a growing issue. And I have a colleague, Sean Carlton at the University of Manitoba, who does a lot of good work around this of trying to say, we need to work against this narrative because we have an overwhelming amount of evidence that children died at these schools in numbers much greater than the general population. And all of what we're doing now is trying to find their resting places, trying to provide that information so that communities can seek the justice they deserve, but also do the healing that they need and do the ceremonies that they need to bring the children home in whatever way that makes sense for them. So that's really what we're doing right now. We're just trying to help to bring additional evidence about specific locations that children might be buried.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kisha Supernant. We are officially at 9:01. So with this last question and answer, I think our time has come to an end. So thank you so much. And I hope, we'll see you, everybody here, we'll see you in the next event. So
Yes.
thank you. And thank you.
You.